When people think of Queen Isabella of Castile, they picture the powerful ruler who sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage and helped shape modern Spain. But hidden beneath the crown lies a disturbing truth. Isabella is remembered as one of history's most unhygienic monarchs. She openly bragged that she had bathed only twice in her entire life, once at birth and once before her wedding night. In her own words, she believed bathing was sinful and dangerous to health, a belief that was surprisingly common among European royals of her time. The fear of water was tied to medieval superstition. Many doctors claimed that warm baths opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to disease. As a result, Isabella avoided water altogether, choosing instead to cover her body with perfumes, powders, and heavy fabrics. Her court, following her example, also shunned bathing. Instead of soap and water, nobles drowned themselves in scented oils to mask the stench of sweat, rot, and decay. Contemporary accounts described her presence as overwhelming. Servants and courtiers wrote about the suffocating odor in the royal chambers, where clothing, hair, and skin were rarely cleaned. Isabella's devotion to religion only strengthened her refusal to bathe, since she viewed cleanliness of the soul as far more important than cleanliness of the body. But her personal habits had consequences. Physicians noted recurring skin conditions and sores, worsened by the lack of hygiene. Her gowns never washed properly, often carried lice and fleas, spreading infestations within the palace. Even when plagues raged across Europe, Isabella's fear of bathing remained stronger than her fear of disease. What makes Isabella's story shocking is that she was not alone. Across Europe, the idea that bathing was dangerous dominated royal courts. And as we move deeper into this list, the question grows darker. If one of the most powerful queens of Europe believed water was poison, how many others lived and ruled in filth? King James I, the same monarch who gave the world the King James Bible, carried a reputation not only for intellect, but also for an unbearable stench. Despite his brilliance in literature and politics, James had a deep fear of water, believing like many of his contemporaries that bathing could spread disease. Unlike Isabella of Castile, who openly admitted her habits, James's filth was described by horrified courtiers and foreign visitors who left written records of their disgust. James believed that water weakened the body, so he avoided washing altogether. He rarely changed his clothes, wearing the same garments until they were stained, greasy, and crawling with vermin. Servants often reported that lice could be seen running across his collars and cuffs, humiliating sight for a man who ruled the powerful kingdoms of England and Scotland. Personal hygiene for James meant little more than rubbing his hands with a linen cloth. She believed cleaned him sufficiently. His teeth rotted early, and his breath was said to be unbearable. Some records even claim that his doctors recommended he brush his teeth with honey and ashes, a method that only worsened the smell. Foreign ambassadors often complained about being forced to sit close to James during audiences. One remarked that his odor was so strong it made it difficult to concentrate on diplomacy. Yet in James's court, no one dared speak openly about it. He was king, and his word was law, even if his very presence made courtiers choke back nausea. Strangely, James considered himself a man of learning and refinement, writing books on kingship and even demonology. But while he was fascinated with ideas and philosophy, he completely ignored the most basic standards of bodily care. His neglect of hygiene was so severe that even his marriage bed was said to be stained with dirt and filth, forcing his queen to endure the stench in silence. James's story reveals the bizarre contradiction of early modern royalty, a king who commanded respect for his wisdom, yet lived in conditions that would horrify even the poorest peasants today. But James was not the worst of them. In fact, some royals carried their disgust for bathing even further, turning filth into a twisted badge of pride. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, is remembered for his dazzling court at Versailles, his endless wars, and his absolute control over France. Yet behind the golden halls and sparkling chandeliers, Louis carried a dark secret. He almost never bathed. Instead, he drowned his body in perfume so strong that visitors often left the palace with headaches from the overwhelming scent. Louis suffered from lifelong health issues, including abscesses, mouth infections, and skin conditions. Doctors at the time believed bathing could worsen these problems, so they advised against washing. Obedient to his physicians, Louis avoided water entirely, often going years without a proper bath. His solution was to change linen shirts frequently, believing that clean fabric against the skin would absorb dirt and sweat. In reality, the layers of fabric simply trapped odor. Versailles became a palace of stench. Though its halls glittered with mirrors and marble, they reeked of sweat, rot, and waste. Visitors recorded how the king's courtiers, imitating him, relied on powder and perfume rather than water. Toilets were scarce in the palace, and it was common to find courtiers relieving themselves in stairwells or corners. In such an environment, Louis's refusal to bathe didn't stand out as much as one might think, but it left the royal chambers suffocating. The king himself loved rich foods and suffered from terrible digestion. Combined with his lack of bathing, this left him with a reputation for unbearable smells. His doctors recorded that his body was plagued with sores, and after medical treatments that involved bleeding and purging, he was rarely cleaned. Instead, layers of musk, rose, oil, and ambergris were applied to mask the odor. Ironically, Louis XIV set the standard for fashion and elegance across Europe. Other monarchs and nobles copied his powdered wigs, embroidered coats, and lavish ceremonies. Yet beneath the silks and jewels was a man so dirty that even his closest attendants complained privately of the unbearable stench. The contradiction is chilling. The most powerful and glamorous king of his age ruled while reeking of decay. Perfume became his armor, hiding the truth from the public. But while Louis masked his filth with roses and musk, another royal much further east believed dirt itself was a sign of strength. Peter the Great is often remembered as the ruler who dragged Russia into the modern age, built a navy, forced nobles to shave their beards, and introduced Western ideas into his empire. But while Peter reformed the state, his own body was a battlefield of filth. He was notorious for his complete disregard for hygiene, leaving foreign visitors stunned by his crude and dirty habits. Unlike some royals who avoided water out of fear, Peter's filth was tied to his wild lifestyle. He loved heavy drinking, rowdy feasts, and crude jokes. His table manners horrified even his closest advisors. He often spit on the floor, wiped his nose on his sleeve, and picked at his teeth with dirty knives. Bathing was something he rarely bothered with, even though Russia had a long tradition of steam baths. To Peter, dirt was not shameful. It was part of his rough, almost barbaric identity. Accounts from his court describe how Peter would wear the same clothes for weeks, stained with grease, sweat, and even blood from his drunken brawls. His boots were caked with mud and lice were said to crawl in his unwashed hair. Foreign ambassadors recorded that being near him was difficult, not only because of his unpredictable temper, but also because of the overwhelming stench. Even in his efforts to westernize Russia, Peter refused to apply the same civilization to himself. He forced nobles to dress in European styles, but ignored the basics of hygiene. His medical issues only worsened this filth. He suffered from epileptic fits, infections, and painful urinary problems. Yet he almost never cleaned himself properly after medical treatments. Instead, bandages were left dirty and wounds often festered. Despite his stench, Peter demanded absolute loyalty. Those who dared mock his habits faced cruel punishments. For him, filth became a kind of symbol, proof that he was tougher than the delicate perfumed kings of Europe. He wanted to be seen as a man of iron will, unbothered by softness or refinement. But in reality, his foul lifestyle left him riddled with disease and pain by the end of his life. Peter the Great may have modernized Russia on paper, but in his personal life, he clung to dirt and filth, as though they were badges of honor. And while his stench shocked ambassadors, another monarch would take the disgust even further, a king whose chamber pots overflowed. Inside one of the most famous palaces in the world, Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 wives, his break from the Catholic Church, and his ruthless pursuit of power. But behind the image of the Grand Tudor monarch was a man plagued by filth, disease, and decay. By the end of his life, Henry's body had become so foul that courtiers dreaded being in his presence. As a young man, Henry was athletic and handsome. But years of overeating, heavy drinking, and injury transformed him into an obese, sickly ruler. He avoided bathing regularly, partly because of superstition, and partly because his massive ulcers made washing painful. His legs were covered in festering sores that oozed pus. His doctors often had to lance them, leaving his chambers reeking of blood and infection. Servants recorded that the smell was unbearable, so strong that even strong perfumes could not mask it. Henry's size also made it difficult to clean himself properly. His enormous body required special devices just to move him from bed to chair, and even then, washing was neglected. His bedding, clothes, and bandages were rarely cleaned thoroughly, creating a breeding ground for lice and infection. His breath was described as rancid, the result of rotting teeth and endless feasts of red meat and sweets. The king's palaces were little better. Toilets were primitive, and chamber pots often spilled over in his private apartments. Combined with his own lack of hygiene, the royal quarters became suffocating. Foreign ambassadors frequently complained of the stench and of the king's foul appearance, but none dared speak too openly. After all, Henry was known to execute even his closest friends for small offenses. What makes Henry's case so disturbing is the contrast between his power and his decay. He ruled England with absolute authority, demanding loyalty and obedience, yet his own body was collapsing into filth. The mighty king, who had once embodied strength and majesty, became a rotting figure, carried about like a corpse that still clung to the throne. Henry VIII's story shows the horrifying reality of royal life, that power and wealth could not shield a king from the consequences of filth. But Henry was not alone. In France, another monarch's dirty habits shocked visitors just as much. A ruler who thought washing his face was enough to be clean. If Louis XIV drowned himself in perfume to hide his filth, his great-grandson Louis XV took the royal disgust for bathing to an even stranger level. Known as Louis the Beloved in his youth, he became infamous in private for habits that shocked even his closest courtiers. Despite living in the lavish splendor of Versailles, Louis XV rarely bathed. Instead, he believed that washing only his face and hands was enough to be considered clean. The king's physicians encouraged this routine. Like earlier doctors, they claimed water could spread disease or weaken the body. Louis took this advice literally, going long stretches without a single bath. Instead, he dusted himself with powder, changed linen shirts, and drenched himself in cologne. His mistresses and courtiers often did the same, creating a palace that glittered on the outside but stank of sweat and rot underneath. What made Louis XV particularly notorious was the contradiction between his public image and his private reality. He surrounded himself with luxury, gold halls, crystal chandeliers, and elaborate gardens, yet lived in filth behind closed doors. His mistresses, including the famous Madame de Pompadour, had to endure his body odor, which grew worse as he aged and grew sickly. His neglect of hygiene extended beyond his body. Louis was careless about his surroundings, allowing chamber pots to overflow in his apartments. Visitors often complained that Versailles, though beautiful, smelled like urine and rot in its corridors. Foreign guests described the suffocating odor of his chambers, hidden beneath layers of musk and rosewater. By the end of his reign, Louis XV's health declined sharply. He suffered from smallpox and other ailments, and his filthy living conditions only worsened his condition. When he finally died, his body decayed so rapidly that mourners fled the stench, and his funeral procession was carried out in haste to avoid further embarrassment. Louis XV's story is a chilling reminder that even in the height of elegance, filth ruled behind the velvet curtains. His refusal to bathe became a symbol of Versailles itself, dazzling on the surface, but rotting within. Yet the final royal on this list may be the most shocking of all, a monarch whose filth was so legendary that even his closest attendants whispered about it in horror. Elizabeth I is remembered as one of the greatest monarchs in history. She defeated the Spanish Armada, inspired a golden age of culture, and ruled England with unmatched intelligence and willpower. But behind the legend of the Virgin Queen was a personal habit that shocked even her contemporaries. Elizabeth openly admitted that she bathed only once a month, whether she needed it or not. First, Elizabeth's standard might sound like an improvement compared to rulers who bathed once in a lifetime. But even monthly bathing was considered radical at the time. Her own courtiers often whispered that the Queen's chambers smelled of unwashed fabrics, sweat, and perfumes meant to mask the stench. Elizabeth relied heavily on cosmetics, especially thick white lead makeup, to cover smallpox scars on her face. This makeup was never fully cleaned off and instead layered over itself day after day, mixing with sweat and dirt. Her skin reportedly became cracked and foul-smelling beneath the paint. Her hair, stiff with powders and oils, was rarely washed, attracting lice and fleas. Her court followed her example. Many nobles believed washing weakened the body and spread disease, so they copied her monthly bathing habit or avoided water altogether. To Elizabeth, what mattered was appearance, not the body beneath the gown. She demanded fresh gowns and rich perfumes, but the garments themselves were rarely washed. Foreign ambassadors often remarked on her strange beauty, radiant from afar but unsettling up close. The thick layers of makeup cracked on her face, her breath carried a sour odor from decaying teeth, and the strong perfumes only partly hid the filth of her body. Yet no one dared criticize her openly. Elizabeth was feared and admired, and her word could send a courtier to the Tower of London. The contradiction in Elizabeth's life is stark. She projected an image of power, purity, and grace. Yet her private reality was one of filth, rotting teeth, and unwashed skin. To her people, she was the Virgin Queen, untouchable and divine. But to those who lived closest to her, she was a monarch whose hygiene was as questionable as any of her predecessors. And so, the truth is laid bare. From Spain to England, from France to Russia, some of history's most powerful rulers lived in filth that would horrify us today. Their crowns were polished, their palaces were golden, but their bodies reeked of decay. In the end, the disgusting royals who never bathe remind us that behind the grandeur of monarchy often lurked the stench of neglect, superstition, and decay.